The can hit the desk first. Then it hit her. Cold, sticky, carbonated liquid soaking through Diane Okafor's blazer in front of 31 colleagues on the trading floor of Meridian Financial Group. Her breath stopped. Her hands froze flat on her keyboard. Regional Manager Scott Heller was laughing, the kind that starts quiet and gets louder the more faces it collects. And 31 people were deciding, in real time, whether to laugh with him. What Scott Heller didn't know, the man stepping off the elevator behind him had just been on the phone with the Meridian board for the past 4 hours. What security called him changed everything. Rewind 6 months. This is where it actually started. The first time Diane Okafor walked into Meridian Financial Group's Chicago headquarters, she carried a leather portfolio her mother had given her when she graduated from Wharton. The building was 42 floors of glass and steel on Wacker Drive, a lobby paved in black granite so polished you could see yourself in it. A reception desk staffed by 3 people in suits that cost more than Diane's first car. She'd grown up in Inglewood. She knew what money looked like when it wanted you to know it was money. Meridian wanted you to know. She'd spent 11 years building toward this. Undergraduate in economics from Northwestern, MBA from Wharton, with a concentration in quantitative finance, 4 years at a boutique investment firm in New York, where she'd managed a portfolio that averaged 22% annual returns in a market that was averaging 9%. She had the numbers. She had the credentials. She had the kind of track record that made headhunters leave voicemails that started with the phrase, "I know you're probably not looking." But when Meridian came calling, she hadn't needed much convincing. The regional director role represented the next step. Leadership, scale, real resources behind the strategies she'd been developing on a shoestring for 4 years. What she didn't account for was Scott Heller. Scott Heller had been regional manager of Meridian's Chicago mid-market division for 7 years. He'd gotten the job the way a certain type of person always gets certain types of jobs. He was there. He was loud. And the man who hired him had gone to the same college and recognized the same particular confidence that gets mistaken for competence at a distance. Scott had an MBA from a program no one asked about twice. A track record he'd inflated so successfully over 7 years that the inflation had become the record. And a corner office with a view of Lake Michigan that he'd convinced himself he'd earned through merit rather than proximity to the right people at the right moment. He drove a BMW 7 Series with a vanity plate. He wore cufflinks to internal meetings. He called his assistant by a nickname she'd never agreed to. The moment Scott saw Diane's title on the organizational chart, Regional Director Senior, reporting to the division head above Scott's own level, he understood that she wasn't there to work for him. She was there to eventually replace him or supersede him. That understanding settled into the base of his skull and didn't move. Their first meeting, he offered her coffee and made a joke about how she'd have to work twice as hard to earn the team's respect. She'd smiled and said she always worked twice as hard. He'd laughed like it was a funny answer. It wasn't a funny answer. It was the truth, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Remember this detail. It matters later. Every morning at 8:15, Scott held what he called a floor check. Not a meeting, he was careful to say, just a check-in. He'd walk the trading floor, stop at desks, ask questions, make comments. The comments were the problem, not always. Not overtly, but over weeks, Diane cataloged them the way she cataloged market data, with attention, precision, and patience for a pattern to emerge. He called her analysts by their first names. He called Diane's analysts by last name, or not at all. He held impromptu strategy sessions at the standing table near the windows and CC'd everyone except her. He forwarded client emails to junior associates for responses on accounts she managed. then took credit for the outcomes in division calls. Small things, the kind that individually could be explained away. Collectively, they added up to something that had a name, and the name wasn't accident. Diane said nothing. She documented everything. She'd learned this from her father, who had built a construction company in a city and an era that didn't hand black men contracts, and who had kept records so meticulous that when partners tried to cut him out after 20 years, the records had been the difference between losing everything and winning. She'd inherited his handwriting and his instinct. Write it down. Date it. Keep it somewhere safe. 6 weeks in, the first incident. Scott held a client lunch she hadn't been invited to. A lunch with the Carver Group account she'd personally brought to Meridian from her previous firm. She found out from the account rep, who emailed her afterward to say that Scott had introduced himself as the lead on the account and that they'd really enjoyed his presentation on the Q4 strategy. Her Q4 strategy. The one she'd spent 3 weeks building. She called the account rep, clarified the organizational structure, rebuilt the relationship. She documented the incident, said nothing to Scott. But here's where it gets interesting. 3 weeks after that, Scott Heller walked past her desk during the 8:15 floor check and said, loudly enough for 6 nearby desks to hear, that maybe she was better suited for a compliance role since analytics clearly wasn't her strength. Her Q3 performance numbers had just come in. Her division was up 18%. The floor average was 11. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said she'd keep that in mind and went back to her screen. Someone nearby laughed quietly. Someone else didn't. She documented the incident, said nothing to Scott. The thing about people like Scott Heller is that silence reads as permission, not weakness. They're smart enough to read weakness, but permission. They interpret the absence of pushback as confirmation that the world works the way they've always believed it works. And belief, once confirmed, accelerates into certainty. Certainty into carelessness. Carelessness into mistakes. Scott Heller was becoming careless. By month 4, he'd started the nickname. D, not a nickname Diane used, not a nickname she'd offered, not a nickname anyone who knew her used. He'd introduced her as D in an external meeting with a banking partner. She'd corrected him in the room, calmly, and he'd laughed and said she was formal, and the banker had smiled uncomfortably, and the meeting had moved on. She documented it. At the end of month 3, something shifted. Scott's pattern changed, not in frequency, but in audience. He'd started performing for a specific subset of the floor, the 3 most senior male associates, the ones who held informal social power on the team, whose opinions rippled outward. He'd stopped making his comments in passing and started making them in clusters, where those 3 were likely to see. He wanted witnesses. He wanted to establish a consensus. Diane recognized this phase. She'd read about it. She'd heard about it from 2 women she trusted, who had been through it in other industries. The shift from individual behavior to group validation was the escalation that preceded removal. He was building a case, the informal kind. The kind that lives in whispered conversations and sideways looks, and the slow crystallization of a room's opinion around a story someone has been quietly telling for months. He was laying groundwork. The specific incident that clarified this for her happened on a Thursday afternoon in month 3. A client call with Meridian's largest institutional account. $40 billion in assets under management. A relationship that predated Diane's hire, and that Scott had positioned himself as the face of for years. Diane had been added to the account's management structure in her first week, per her contract. Scott had never mentioned it to the clients. On this call, he introduced her as his new analytical support. The clients were polite. Diane corrected the framing smoothly and professionally and managed the call's technical content so effectively that the lead portfolio director at the client firm emailed her directly afterward, not Scott, Diane, with 3 follow-up questions. She documented the call. She documented the email. She documented the correction she'd made and Scott's expression when she made it. And then she looked at a wall calendar and understood that she was running out of patience, which was dangerous, because the moment she ran out of patience, she would stop being careful. She called her husband that night and said she thought they needed to have a conversation soon about timing. Marcus said he agreed. He also said he had some news about a project he'd been working on for 8 months that she should probably hear. She asked what kind of project. He said the kind that would require her to trust his judgment on the timing. She said she always trusted his judgment on timing. He said he knew. He said be patient a little longer. She said how long? He said 6 weeks, maybe 8. She said fine. That conversation, the one neither of them fully named, would matter enormously in 6 weeks. But not yet. Marcus listened, the way he always listened, carefully, without interrupting, without minimizing. Marcus had a way of hearing the shape of a problem underneath the words describing it. He'd gotten that from law school, probably, or from the years after when he'd restructured 3 mid-sized companies and learned that the most expensive problem is always the one no one will name in the room. He told her to keep documenting. She told him she was. He asked if she needed him to do anything. She said not yet. He said he was ready when she needed him. She believed him. He meant it. What Diane didn't know was that while she was documenting Scott's behavior, something else entirely was happening above both of their heads. In the glass and mahogany rooms of Meridian's executive floor, 2 months earlier, Meridian Financial Group's majority shareholder had initiated a quiet acquisition conversation. The kind that happens in the negative spaces between public disclosures, in private meetings, in attorney conference calls, in documents circulated under strict ENDA. Okafor Capital Partners, a mid-market investment firm founded 11 years ago, had been quietly assembling a position in Meridian through a series of funds that made the ownership structure difficult to trace, until you were meant to trace it. Marcus Okafor, founder and chairman, was very good at making ownership structures difficult to trace until the right moment. The right moment was this month. The acquisition terms had been finalized the previous evening. The board meeting had run until 2 in the morning. By the time Diane arrived at Meridian's Chicago floor at 7:50 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, the paperwork was complete. The announcement was drafted, and her husband was in a car on his way from a conference room on the 42nd floor to a meeting that would be held on Diane's floor, with Diane's colleagues, about the future of Meridian Financial Group. Diane didn't know this. Scott Heller certainly didn't know this. At 10:24 a.m., Scott Heller walked past the break room alcove near the east windows where Diane was refilling her coffee. He had a can of sparkling water. He'd been in a good mood all morning, the kind of mood that made certain people more dangerous, not less. He stopped. He looked at Diane's blazer, a camel cashmere blazer she'd bought 6 years ago and worn on every important day since, because it was the one her mother had said made her look like someone who ran things. He made a comment about the color. Someone nearby smiled. He said something else, something about whether she was trying to blend into the furniture, and the laughter got a little wider, a little louder, and Scott Heller had an audience, which was all he ever really needed. Then he shook the can twice, cracked it, and tilted it deliberately toward her blazer. The soda came out fast and cold and hit her chest before she registered what was happening. She stepped back. The can clattered against the edge of her keyboard. The liquid spread across the camel cashmere in a dark stain that would not come out. She knew immediately. Would not come out. Scott was laughing. A few people around him laughed. More people were silent in the way of people who know something is wrong, but have decided not to be the one who says it. Diane Okafor stood completely still. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were level. She was doing what her father had taught her, and what 11 years of professional survival had refined. She was not giving him her reaction. He didn't get that. He didn't get to see what this cost her. The elevator opened behind Scott. The security guard, Thomas, who Diane knew by name because Diane knew everyone's name, stepped out first. Behind him, a man in a dark suit with the kind of bearing that fills rooms before the person enters them. The man looked around the floor with calm, precise attention, the way someone looks at a space they've just bought. Because he had. Thomas said, in a voice that carried across the floor in the sudden quiet, "Mr. Okafor, sir, would you like to start here or go directly to the 42nd floor?" The floor went silent so completely you could hear the ventilation system. 31 people watched Scott Heller turn around. What Scott saw: a tall black man in a suit that cost more than Scott's BMU payment, standing next to building security who was calling him sir, with an expression that was entirely neutral in the way of someone who is deciding something and has already decided it. What Scott did not yet understand, the organizational chart he'd been so carefully studying for 6 months, had just been revised at the top. And the woman behind him, the one dripping sparkling water onto the marble floor, the one he'd been systematically undermining since September, was this man's wife. What the 31 people on the floor understood in the following 3 seconds, the can in the break room alcove, the laughter that had followed it, the 6 months of small dismissals they had witnessed and said nothing about, all of it had an audience now that hadn't been there before. And that audience had just been called chairman by building security, and the word was spreading desk to desk across the floor, in the way that news spreads in open-plan offices, in a ripple of whispers and turned heads, and the quiet reprocessing of everything a person thought they understood about the room they were standing in. Scott Heller's mouth opened. A sound started and stopped. The 3 senior associates, the ones he'd spent 2 months cultivating as an audience, did not look at him. They looked at each other, then at their screens, then anywhere else. Marcus Okafor looked at Diane. Diane looked at Marcus. A full second of communication passed between them in the way of 2 people who have been married for 14 years and know each other's faces better than their own. Then Marcus looked at Scott Heller. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice entirely pleasant. "I don't think we've met." "Marcus Okafor." He extended his hand. "I'm the new majority shareholder. The board would like to do introductions on the floor before the formal announcement. But first, could someone get my wife something to clean that up?" Scott's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The color left his face in a single movement, like a tide going out. Around the floor, 31 people reprocessed everything they had just watched. The can, the laughter, the silence that had let it happen, and the woman standing in the middle of it, still perfectly composed, who was apparently married to the man who now owned the building they were all sitting in. One of Diane's analysts, a 26-year-old named Keisha, who had watched every incident for 4 months and written nothing down because she hadn't known it was safe to, stood up from her desk and walked to the break room for paper towels without being asked. She brought them back and offered them to Diane without looking at Scott once. That mattered. It all mattered. and everyone on the floor understood it was all being recorded by a kind of memory that doesn't need paper. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned to Thomas and said he'd like to speak with HR and legal on the 42nd floor in 15 minutes, and then he'd like a conversation with the floor's supervisory staff, and could someone let the division head know he'd be available by noon. Thomas said yes, sir, and went back to the elevator. Marcus walked to Diane. He looked at her blazer. His jaw moved once. Then he said, quietly enough that only she heard, "How long?" She said, 6 months. "I have documentation." He nodded once. "I know you do." He hadn't doubted it for a second. Scott Heller met with HR at 11 that morning. By noon, his access badge had been deactivated. Meridian's legal department had contacted their employment counsel by 12:30. By end of business that Tuesday, Scott's office had been packed by building services, the B&W cufflinks, the framed photo, the diploma he'd always kept turned slightly so visitors could read it. The items were in 3 boxes by the door. Security waited with him for the elevator. What the investigation found over the following 2 weeks went further than anyone had publicly expected. Diane's 6 months of documentation, dates, times, witnesses, verbatim quotes, email threads, forwarded communications with her account contacts, and recordings she'd made of the 3 incidents where Scott had been particularly explicit, provided the foundation. Keisha came forward. 4 other analysts came forward. One senior associate had kept notes of his own. The HR team assembled a record that the employment attorney later described, in a deposition, as among the most thoroughly documented workplace discrimination cases she'd encountered in 22 years of practice. The Carver Group account, the one Scott had attempted to absorb, was formally returned to Diane's management within the week. Its portfolio director sent Diane a note that said he'd assumed something was wrong 6 months ago and wished he'd said something then. She wrote back and said she appreciated it, and that it was the kind of thing people needed to say at the time rather than afterward. He agreed. Scott Heller did not go quietly into the paperwork. He hired an attorney within 48 hours, filed a counter-complaint alleging unfair termination, and told the attorney he had witnesses who would confirm that Diane had been adversarial and difficult to work with from her first week. His attorney interviewed those witnesses. The witnesses, the 3 senior associates he'd spent months cultivating, declined to corroborate his account. 2 of them offered statements that went in the opposite direction. His attorney called him the following morning and advised him to settle. He settled. The terms were confidential. His LinkedIn profile went dark 6 days after his last day at Meridian, and when it reappeared 3 months later, the Meridian position was listed without dates. Marcus Okafor completed the formal transition to controlling shareholder in December. The announcement ran in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and 3 Chicago papers. The photo they used was taken on the 42nd floor, Marcus at the center of the boardroom table, and if you looked carefully at the framed photo on the credenza in the background, you could see a camel cashmere blazer folded over a chair. Marcus had kept it. He said it was a reminder of what it cost to stay quiet in rooms where you deserved to be loud. Diane was named Chief Investment Officer of Meridian's expanded Midwest division in January. Her portfolio strategy, the one she'd been building since before anyone at Meridian knew her name, was adopted as the firm's flagship methodology. At the division launch, she gave a speech that lasted 4 minutes and contained no unnecessary words. She talked about her father's records, about the construction company he'd built in a city that didn't want him to build it, about what it meant to document your work in an industry that would rather you forgot the details, about the analysts in this building, and she looked at Keisha when she said it, who had watched and waited. and come forward when it mattered. She said, "Excellence is not the argument. Excellence is the floor. What you build on top of it, that's the argument." 300 people gave her a standing ovation. 6 months after that, on a Tuesday morning in July, Diane Okafor walked into Meridian's headquarters the way she walked in every morning, through the granite lobby, badge to the reader, elevator to the executive floor. The same building, entirely different world. Her analyst team had grown from 6 to 22. Her portfolio's annual return was running at 26% against a market average of 12. On her desk, a framed photo of her and Marcus from the night the acquisition closed, and a leather portfolio her mother had given her the day she graduated from Wharton. She'd kept the blazer too. The stain never did come out. She'd never sent it to be cleaned. It sat in the back of her closet in a dry cleaning bag. And some days when she had a meeting she was walking into, where the room needed to understand who she was before she opened her mouth, she thought about it. About cold liquid and 31 witnesses, and a man who'd laughed because he believed that silence was the same as consent, and that visibility was something he controlled. He'd been wrong about most things. He'd been wrong about that most of all. Diane Okafor pulled out her laptop, opened her calendar, and started her day. She'd been starting her days this way for 38 years. She planned to continue for a very long time.